June 6th, 1944.
The news that I was to command this army group came to me suddenly and indirectly. I read it in the morning paper. On January 18th, as I turned through the lobby of the Dorchester Hotel, bound for breakfast at the mess across the street, I stopped to pick up a copy of the 4-page Daily Express. The clerk at the counter grinned. "This won't be news to you, sir," he said, and pointed to a story in which Eisenhower had announced that 51-year-old Lieutenant General Omar Nelson Bradley, who led the U.S. Second Corps in Tunisia and the invasion of Sicily, is to be the American Army's General Montgomery in the Western invasion in Europe. But it was. For the first inkling I had that my Army Group command was to be more than a temporary one. Eisenhower had just arrived in England, and I had not yet talked with him. In his press conference the day before, the first on his return, Eisenhower had been asked who would command the American ground forces on the invasion. "General Bradley is the senior United States ground commander," was his reply. For the moment, that statement was not clear, for it did not indicate whether Eisenhower meant First Army on the assault or the Army Group as an opposite number to Monty. It was not until later that Eisenhower said he meant the Army Group.
Possibility that essential facts of Overlord, including D-Day as originally set, may have been compromised, has stirred the high-level officials of SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, and the War Department in Washington. A few days ago, Ike received a personal message from General Clayton, the new in the new War Department, G2, saying that the package containing important documents concerning Overlord had been intercepted in Chicago. It had been sent from an Ordnance Division, G4, and erroneously addressed to a private residence in a section of Chicago heavily populated by Germans. The package was poorly wrapped, and according to General Bissell, a casual perusal of the papers was made by 4 unauthorized persons in the headquarters of the Army's 6th Service Division in Chicago, in addition to at least 10 persons in the Chicago Post Office. It appears that the package was addressed by an American soldier who was of German extraction. He states that his sister, who lives at the Chicago address, has been seriously ill, and thinks he simply erred in writing the address on the package because his mind was preoccupied with thoughts of home. Thus, he wrote his sister's address rather than the proper address of the War Department in Washington. The clumsy handling would indicate that no professional spy was involved, but nevertheless important facts including strength, places, equipment, and tentative target date have been disclosed to an unauthorized person. Just another worry to the Supreme Commander.
Before recommending that the assault be made against the coast of Normandy, Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, Chief of Staff to Eisenhower, had scrutinized the shoreline of Europe all the way to the Netherlands. From the intelligence archives, the British had culled volumes of pattern research on subsoils, bridges, moorings, wharfage, rivers, and thousands of intricate details that went into appraisal of the Overlord plan. "How much dope can you get on the subsoil there?" I asked Dixon when G3 brought me this problem. Several days later, a lean and reticent British naval lieutenant came into our briefing. From his pocket, he pulled out a thick glass tube. He walked over to the map on the wall. "The night before," he explained dryly, "we visited Omaha Beach to drill a core sample in the shingle at this point near the stream running through this draw. You can see by the core there is no evidence of silt. The shingle is firmly bedded upon the rock. There is little danger of your trucks getting bogged down." To get this information, the lieutenant had taken a submarine through the minefields off the coast of France Then he paddled ashore one evening in a rubber boat, directly under the muzzles of the German big casement guns.
Don't be surprised if a Frenchman comes up and kisses you. It means he's damn glad to see you.
D-Day was postponed by Ike for at least 24 hours last night. Weather looks very bad for air support, but suited for the Navy, as wind from the southwest are not expected to be so strong by the morning, when the attacks were to have begun shortly after good light. A large portion of the 4,000 ships already were at sea, from landing craft to battleships. They were notified shortly after 4 a.m. meeting this morning. Each task force was previously instructed to what to do in this possibility.
I love these men. They sleep all over the ship, on the deck, in, on top of, and underneath the vehicles. They smoke, play cards, wrestle around, and indulge in general horseplay. They gather in groups and talk about home, their girls and what is coming ahead of them, and they write letters home. They are good soldiers, the best in the world. Before the invasion of North Africa, I was nervous and a bit scared. During the Sicilian invasion, I was so busy that the fear passed while I was working. This time we will hit the beach in France, and from there on, only God knows the answer. I pray that God will see fit to spare me to you, Ann and Pat.
I am quite positive we must give that order. I don't like it, but there it is. I don't see how we can possibly do anything else. The die is cast.
D-Day is now almost irrevocably set for tomorrow morning, about 6:40. The time varying with the tides at different beaches, the idea being to strike before the high tide submerges obstacles which have to be cleared away. The actual decision was confirmed and made final this morning at 4:15 after all weather dope had been assembled. During yesterday, weather looked as if we might have to postpone for at least 2 more days until Thursday, with the possibility of 2 weeks. Pockets of lows existed all the way from Western Canada, across the United States and the Atlantic, and were coming our way. What was needed was high pressure to counteract or divert at least one of the parading lows. During the night, that actually occurred.
On June 5th, 1944, the Allies invaded German-occupied Western Europe by the way of Normandy, France, during World War II. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have driven and striven these many months. The hope and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In the company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely, but in this year of 1944, much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940 and 1941. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air defense and offense has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and have placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
That night, the moon shone. The sky was clear as one by one the aircraft boosted their engines, roared down the runways. Next to go were the 2 parachute brigades and engineers accompanied by my ADC, Tom Houghton, and David Bird, my GSO2, and my personal escort, my signaler, and my personal driver, Thomas Bateman. Also in the glider were my Jeep with wireless set and 2 motorcycles. In the glider, there were 12 of us in all. Before us lay an hour-and-a-half flight. We hoped the sappers would have cleared away sufficient the stakes to give us a reasonably safe landing zone. At the same time, Gale's glider was being towed through the night across the sky to the west. General Matt Ridgway of the 82nd Airborne Division sat with his stick, a plane full of parachutists, aboard a C-47 transport. Wing to wing, the big planes snuggled close in their tight formation. We crossed to the coast of France. I was sitting straight across the aisle from a doorless exit. Even 1,500 feet, I could tell the channel was rough, for we passed over a small patrol craft, one of the checkpoints for our navigators, and the light displayed for us was bobbing like a cork in the mill rigs. No lights showed on the land, but the pale moon glow I could see clearly, see each farm and field below. And I remember thinking how peaceful the land looked, each house and hedgerow, path, and the little stream bathed in the silver of the moon glow. It was now midnight. Within minutes, the first parachuters would be jumping out over Normandy.
D-Day, June 6, 1944. Go.
Corporal Ted Morris, 225 Parafield Ambulance. The green light went on and we started to jump. About 2 or 3 did so, but Bud Abbott went to jump and fell over because the plane lurched and he became wedged across the door. We dragged him away before we could jump. It was too late for him to jump. But Abbott came back to Normandy with a ruddy glider reinforcements. The best of it was that Abbott was a conscientious objector. We had about a dozen of them in the Parafield Ambulance Unit. They wouldn't shoot or fight, but they acted as good orderlies. A conscientious objector was one who was opposed to serving in the armed forces and or bearing arms on the grounds of moral or religious principles.
Donald Burjak, U.S. 101st Airborne Division. They dropped us all over the damn Cherbourg Peninsula. Lieutenant Muir had arrived by this time. Then 3 French girls, about 18, came running to us with a jug of wine and offered it to us, which I refused as I didn't feel much like being poisoned at the time. I didn't trust anyone. The lieutenant asked if anyone could speak English. The girls said very poor English, that there was an old woman who could. She used to teach it in school. One of the girls brought her to us. Lieutenant Muir asked her where we were, and she did not even know. But the lieutenant brought out his map, and the old woman pointed to the coastal town of Rennevel. She told us there were other Americans here, but also many Germans all around and even in the town itself. Muir thanked the old woman. Muir let out a string of cusses and swore as he examined the map that we were now 12 miles from our drop zone and objectives. They dropped us all over the whole damn Cherbourg Peninsula. He said, who the hell side are they on anyway? Now we've got to fight through 9 towns and 12 miles of enemy country just to get where we were supposed to land and start fighting in the first place.
Major General Richard Gale, 6th Airborne Division. We were flying at about 5,000 feet, and we soon knew the coast was under us, for we were met by a stream of flak. It was weird to see this roaring up of golden chains past the windows of the glider, some of it being apparently between us and the tug craft. Looking out, I could see for the canal and the river through the clouds, for the moon was fairly well overcast, and a clear, crisp moonlight we had hoped for was not there. The few moments we would be in a few moments, we would be over the landing zone and we would be cast off at any moment. Almost as soon as he had said this, we were there. The whistling sound and the roar of the engine suddenly died down. No longer were we bumping about, but gliding along on a gloriously steady course. Away went the tug aircraft back to England. Round we turned, circling lower and lower. The pilot soon turned around to tell us we were just about to land. We linked up by putting our arms around the man next to us. We were also strapped in. In case of a crash, this procedure would help us to take the shock of the landing. I shall never forget the sound as we rushed down in our final steep dive. Then suddenly we flattened out, and soon with a bump, we landed on an extremely rough, stubbled field. Over the field we sped, and then with a bang, we hit a low embankment. The forward undercarriage wheel stove up through the floor. The glider spun around on his nose in a small circle, and one of the wings hit one of those infernal stakes. We drew up to a standstill. When we opened the door outside, all was quiet.
Captain Peter Young, 1st Special Service Brigade. Land ahead now. 100 yards away, a column of water shoots into the air. Away to port, a tank landing craft burns fiercely, ammunition exploding as the crews go over the sides. Ashore is a line of battered houses whose silhouette looks familiar from the photographs. They must surely mark our landing place. On the beach, a few tanks creep about and fire occasional shots at an unseen foe. Somewhere on the front, the guns are shelling us. The flashes are visible every few seconds. The craft slows down. I said, what are we waiting for? There are still 5 minutes to go before H plus go, the craft's young captain replies. I said, I don't think anyone will mind if we are a few minutes early on D-Day. Let's go. In fact, most of the landing craft were ordered in by the beachmasters in strict succession and had to wait their turn, milling around offshore in huge herds. This not only made the craft vulnerable to the German shells, but the unpleasant motion on the choppy sea produced yet more motion sickness.
Soldiering on, Ernie Pyle, war correspondent. All American soldiers here are impressed with the loveliness of the Normandy countryside. Except for the swampy places, it is almost a dreamland. Everything is green, rich, and natural looking. There are no fences as such. Little fields bordered by high trees or earthen built about high wastes. After many centuries completed with covered with grass, shrubbery, ferns, and flowers. Normandy differs from England landscape mainly because rural England is fastidiously trimmed, cropped like a Venetian garden, while Normandy's grass needs cutting, hedgerows are wild, and everything is less neatness and more on the way of nature made it. The Summer Dispatch of 1944. I took a walk along the historic coast. This is Ernie Pyle, war correspondent. I took a walk along the historic coast of Normandy of France. It's a lovely day for a stroll along the seashore. Men were sleeping in the sand. Some of them sleep forever. Men floating in the water. They did not know they were in the water, for they were dead. I walked a mile and a half along the water's edge of our many piled invasion beaches. Many mile invasion beaches. We wanted to walk slowly to see the detail of the infinity, the wreckage, the vast, startling, the awful waste and destruction of war, aside from the cost of human life. As I stood there, I noticed a group of freshly taken German prisoners standing nearby. They were not put in the prison cage. No prisoners were looking out at the sea, the same bitter sea for months and years, so safely empty before their gaze. They did not say a word to each other. They did not need to. The expressions on their face is something forever unforgettable. It is the horrific acceptance of their doom. If all the German people could have had the same rich experience standing on this bluff, looking out across the water, they would see what their compatriots saw. That's the end of my part of D-Day. Chuck, you're up.
We've been equating June 6, 1944 with D-Day. However, as anyone in the military can tell you, these are basically generic terms. Any military operation, planned down to the last detail, is always slated to start at H hour on D-Day. Code names for the time and day of the particular operation. Now, these medals over here represent my father's war record. He joined the Army in 1940, basically to get a better job coming out of the Depression, and ended up spending 6 years in service. Like many of the others from that greatest generation, he didn't say much about it. When we were kids, my brothers and sister and I never said a word. Even after I came home from seeing combat in Vietnam, he very seldom, if ever, talked about it. A number of the things that he would say is, number one, the real heroes are buried overseas. He was lucky, he got home. It's something I've heard many veterans of that generation say. He finally got this rack of medals when he was in his mid-80s, prodded and pestered by family and friends to display his war record. He really didn't need any reminder of that. In one of those off moments when he spoke, one of the things he spoke about was that he was proudest among these medals of his 3 D-Day medals. Now, as I said, he was in the Army in 1940, and he went over right away. His first D-Day was November 8, 1942. He landed in Oran in Algeria, and immediately was up against it. He fought at the Battle of Kasserine Pass against elite German troops commanded by the Desert Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. That was one of the minor first defeats for the Allied forces. But very soon after that, they had a success. The Battle of El Guitar. My dad took part in that one. The commander for that battle was General George Patton. They eventually started pushing the Germans across Africa, and eventually they were able to control the entire top half of Africa. He left there and had his second D-Day on July 9th, 1943. He landed in Gila, Sicily. The hills and valleys of Sicily afforded the Germans an opportunity to be ready defensively. So the fighting was very fierce. There was one time when my dad and his platoon were occupying a hill, firing their mortar rounds in a particular direction. A Jeep pulled up behind them. An officer got off and said, "Sergeant, turn those tubes more to this side." Apparently there was an artillery observation post that needed to be wiped out. My dad immediately obeyed the order, of course, and then turned around to see who gave it to him. It was General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., one of the very few generals to actually land on the beach on June 6th. He fought across most of Sicily, basically under the command of General Truscott, Lucian Truscott, as well as General Patton. One of the things that he had was a runner. Now, because radio communications were sometimes a little suspect, he would have his runner run between his position and the company command post or the battalion command post to relay information back and forth. His runner was a private named James Reese. Now, after they had gotten all the way across Sicily, Reese was promoted and became his own platoon sergeant and had his own men to worry about. A few years ago, before my father passed away, I told him that I had found in the library a book of Medal of Honor citations. And he said, "Look up James Reese, his runner." After he had been promoted to platoon sergeant, Reese crossed over into Italy and was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for some incredible stuff that he did. When I made a copy of that and gave it to my dad, it was the second time in his life that I actually saw him shed a tear. He actually never got into Italy, my father, that is. Once they had secured Sicily, he and the rest of the 1st Division were shipped off to Scotland, of all places. They went to the coast of Scotland and started preparing for an amphibious invasion. They were pretty certain it was going to be in the northern part of France, but that was about all they knew. They went south to the southern shore of England and prepared to cross. And on June 6, 1944, he was in one of those LSTs, or Higgins boats, crossing over. Now the fighting was intense, really intense. Small arms fire, machine gun fire, mortars, artillery. It was just a killing field. The boat brought them in as close to shore as they thought they could get. The ramp went down in front. The first few guys getting off, usually in most of those boats, were shot right away. My dad and his squad jumped out and jumped into the water. The Higgins boat hadn't really gotten that close to shore. When he stepped into the water, he was over his head. He dropped most of his equipment and started basically running or swimming just to get his head above water so he could breathe. Made it into shore. Was one of the very few that actually survived the beach without getting a scratch. Years later, as he was talking to me, one of those few times that he would, he mumbled under his breath, "I should have been killed 10 times." He made it up onto the top of the beachhead and started fighting through the various hedgerows area in the Normandy Peninsula. Took part in most of the major operations. Operation Overlord, of course, D-Day, Operation Market Garden. He finally, with his unit, the 1st Division, started moving into Germany. They approached the town of Aachen. Now, Aachen was a major crossroads, lots of roads converging together, and it was a really important place to capture. Well, they had a plan where they would sweep through, pivoting around one point. And my father's unit was on the very end, so they had to march essentially the longest distance. They got to a certain point where the Germans had set up what they call a time on target. They had already zeroed in their mortars and artillery on this particular spot. They waited until Dad and his unit got there. Only 3 men came out of that field. My father was one of them. He made it into the town of Aachen and joined up with a tank unit that was clearing out some buildings. The tank commander asked him to look around the corner of a building to see if there was anyone on the street. And that was where he got his 2nd wound, shot in the back by a sniper up on a tree, up a church steeple. This was Friday, the 13th of October, 1944. He was wounded pretty bad, but he actually only spent about a month and a half in the hospital getting fixed up and recuperated. He joined his unit just in time to take part in the Battle of the Bulge. A few years ago, when I was still teaching at Wellesley High School, the librarian was going through some old magazines that they used to let the kids do research on. One of them was this one, American History magazine. This is the actual issue. It still has the Wellesley High symbol on the bottom. There was an article in here, a scholarly research article on the Battle of the Bulge. And the librarian, Christine was her name, was flipping through just to see if there was anything interesting in this article. And her eye caught the following paragraph, the last sentence. Sergeant Settimio Tiberio hunkered down low when a Tiger tank rolled right over his foxhole and lived to tell of it. What had happened is that they were on the edge of the Ardennes forest. The 1st Division was asked to hold this particular area. If the Germans had ever found out how thin they were, they could have run right through them. There was 1 man per foxhole every 50 yards or so. My dad was in his. The Germans, instead of doing a mass attack, were sending out these little probes, 1 tank at a time. And a tank approached my father's foxhole. He could have gotten up and ran back, tried to solidify his position maybe, look for some help. Instead, he just hunkered down, but the tank kept coming. He eventually was forced to lie flat down on the bottom of the foxhole, and the tank parked over him. Now, when Christine read that, she immediately called me down from my room where I was teaching. She said, "Do you know this man, Settimio Tiberio?" Well, how many Settimio Tiberios do you think there are in the universe? She said, "Yes, but I had never heard this story." He had never said it to anyone. The only reason it came out was because he had to go in a few years before that for an MRI, and he was asked to lay down and they were going to slide him into this tube, and he refused. And the technician was smart enough to understand that there was something deeper going on. He had a psychologist come in and talk to him, and that's when it all came up. After my dad was wounded that second time, he was told by his commander that he was probably going to be headed home. Now, you might not know this, but there was actually a point system. You would earn points for days in combat, for medals received, for missions that you went on. And if you earned 85 points, you were supposed to be sent home. If you've ever seen the TV special, The Band of Brothers, an extraordinarily accurate representation of the 506th Paratroop Infantry Division, not a single member of that company had the 85 points to go home in 1945. Well, as my dad was laying in the hospital bed and his captain came in and told me he was going home, he also said, "You've got 138 points." So they sent him back to France. He did some training for a while with some officers just to show them what combat was like, and then they sent him home. I look at this and I'm kind of in awe of it. Yes, I saw combat, but what I saw was a walk in the park compared to what he went through. Thank you.
Proud of all we have done, mighty still